like to go right ahead with our speaker, Rebecca Miller. Glad to have you here. She is from the Western Center on Law and Poverty, and we'll be discussing eliminating unjust fines and fees. And I hope you were all able to read the link I sent. I was one of the things, if you can see that, that's San Diego County. So we have a lot of work to do. So with that, I will pass it on to Rebecca.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here and talk with folks. I'm Rebecca, and I'm an attorney at the Western Center on Law and Poverty. We're based in Los Angeles, but I actually work in our satellite Oakland office in Northern California. We're a statewide organization. And in addition to LA and Oakland, we also have an office in Sacramento that where our lobbyists are, who work in Sacramento to get laws changed when we aren't able to improve things through either litigation or administrative advocacy. So I know that Jean reached out to the Debt-Free Justice Coalition, which is, so I'm giving, and Stephanie Campos-Bowie, who's one of the main facilitators of that coalition, asked me, because she's on vacation, if I could come and speak with your group. And so I'll talk generally about the work that Western Center does, and we're part of the Debt-Free Justice Coalition, and try and give an overview today about fines and fees issues, their history a little bit, things that really exciting reforms that have happened in California in the last few years, and then kind of what's still to be done and some of the recent campaigns that everybody is working on. Sound good? Okay, I'm gonna try, this is where I'm always like, I wish I had my 10-year-old here. I'm gonna try to share my screen. Let me know if this doesn't work.
And can everyone mute so we're not hearing background noise? Everyone but Rebecca. Margie, on your phone, it may be.
Can you mute my phone? I'm on a cell phone and I don't know how to mute.
Yes, I will.
*6.
*6.
Are you all seeing the slide that says an overview of fines and fees? Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay, great. So I gave a brief introduction about Western Center, but I always like to make sure people know who we are. We are a social justice organizations. We work on housing, public benefits issues, economic justice issues, and healthcare issues on behalf of low-income Californians throughout the state. And we do this through litigation, through changing legislation, through organizing campaigns, and administrative advocacy. And we're trying to make things better, basically, for low-income Californians in our wonderful but very expensive state. Sorry, this got left in here. It talks a little bit. So like I said, sort of my goals for today were just to kind of give an overview about fines and fees issues generally, and kind of what has been happening in California during the last 10 years. We've had some really important changes, and there's a growing movement of criminal justice reform generally, of which fines and fees are an important part, and what's going on now, and some things that you all might keep your eyes out for as part of your work in San Diego specifically. So I thought I would just start a little bit with what are fines and fees. I use it as a shorthand a lot and talk about when I'm, what kind of work do I do? I really do focus on a lot of fines and fees issues, but it gets thrown out there as a sort of summary term. But so I just wanted to break it down a little bit. When we talk about fines, we're often talking about the monetary penalty that someone gets in a punitive sense for something they've done. And it's something that often depends on the severity of your crime, what your fine might be. Then there are fees, which can be surcharges that are added onto that. I'm going to talk about an example of a traffic ticket later, but there can be fees that get added on as surcharges and assessments that we use to fund government services. There can also be sort of administrative fees, user fees kind of, that we charge people, like a filing fee, for example. If you go and file a court document, you sometimes have to pay a filing fee. And then there's also restitution, which is in sort of an important part of this world, which ideally is something that's supposed to be making a victim whole. But it can also, relate to kind of making the government whole for something that somebody might have done that incurred cost for the government. Those are what fines and fees are. Just generally, they come up in all parts of government, but primarily in the criminal system, and the criminal system kind of includes also infractions, which are more tickets, parking tickets, traffic tickets, and things like that. That many more of us might experience than the sort of traditional criminal system that we think of. And then I wanted to talk just a little bit about this idea about fines and fees and their history. They're not a new thing. And I'm going to shift a little bit away from fines and talk about fees, administrative fees, because that is really where the reform effort is leading right now. I'm going to talk about why that is and what is particularly harmful about criminal fees, administrative fees that we charge Californians. So of course, fees and fines play a role throughout human history. And I have this Supreme Court case here, Timms versus Indiana. And if anybody wants to get way in the lawyer weeds, you can go and read that. And it was a unanimous decision where Ginsburg and Clarence Thomas agreed with each other on a lot of things and talking about the history of fines and fees leading up to the founding of the United States. And we talk about the Boston Tea Party. There's all sorts of protections in our Constitution about excessive fines and fees because of the history of the way that was used in the feudal system and this idea and in colonialism and extracting wealth from colonies. And then, it continues on in our history. It was something that was used a lot and it has roots in slavery and in Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and continues on today in terms of how we're trying to fund, how we did, hopefully, I'll say that, fund the sort of oversized criminal justice system that the United States has. That really expanded exponentially in the 1980s and the 1990s, where we had this tough on crime trend and all kinds of three strikes laws and things like that. It was very expensive. All of the infrastructure that went to that just exploded in terms of its growth. And the money to fund that had to come from somewhere. And there's a lot of the fines and fees that we charge and try and shift to criminal defendants come from this sort of oversized criminal legal system that we built up, and we're looking for ways to fund, because it was also happening at the same time when Reagan was in power and there was this idea of limited government. And running through all of these issues, particularly in the United States, is the real important role of how fines and fees, and again, fees in particular, have such a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And this is both because of some of their express use in Reconstruction and Jim Crow as a way of control and limiting the wealth generation and economic mobility of Black Americans, but also the sort of implicit stereotypes that go into things. We think about, I work on a lot of public benefits issues too. But we had this, the terrible myth of the super predator, of the sort of accountability of who a criminal defendant is, who the welfare queen is. There's a lot of sort of racist stereotypes that underline a lot of the things in government that we then are charging people for, because there is this sort of implicit and sometimes even more express racism in the way we're designing our systems. And then there's also the sort of the structural racism that we have in the United States, right, which has led to communities of color having fewer resources and being also over policed. So we know, and I know this is something that your committee has looked at too, is the issue of traffic stops and over policing of people of color in California. And what happens is that we are then pulling more people into these criminal systems. So then, and there's a twofold dynamic. There's both overrepresentation in our infraction, traffic, and criminal systems because of over policing and because of the implicit bias that goes into over policing. But then there's also, because of the structural racism and the wealth gap in our country, there's less of an ability of, there's just less economic wealth in communities of color generally to be able to afford to pay for the fines and fees, and it can often lead to trapping people in debt. And I just pause right there because I really think that that fees in particular get glossed over as being a form of accountability. You know, I ran a stop sign and now I have to pay this fine. But loaded in and connected with all of our interactions with any kind of enforcement or criminal legal system in the United States, in California, are these fees that are added on top of it. And what we're doing there is we're using these interactions with our citizens to fund government services. And the problem with that is that we are then, because of the disproportionate representation of people who have lower economic means, it's essentially like a regressive tax. We are funding or trying to fund our government through by charging people fees, add-on surcharges, and things like that of the people who can least afford it. And you know, we often refer to this as high pain, low gain. And sometimes when, you know, I've reviewed a lot of Public Records Act requests about counties and cities' use of these fees, they factor in a very low collection rate, right? Because you're piling fees onto people who cannot necessarily afford it. And so they're thinking, well, we'll collect 20 to 30% of this, but each one of those dollars is attached to a human being who is then getting collection notices, having involuntary collection from the franchise tax board of the state, experiencing getting trapped in this debt that is very dramatically impacting their life. And I think the article that was passed around was particularly about juvenile fees, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's a very high level of pain. It can lead to all sorts of collateral consequences for the individuals who carry around this debt that is often is a funding mechanism for the government, and yet the government is spending high percentages of money to collect very little. And sometimes, you know, in some instances, we even find that it's a wash after you factor in the low collection rate because you're collecting money from people who don't have money, and you're using these involuntary collection means. Sometimes localities are basically using the same amount of money to collect the same amount of fees that they're collecting. I see a hand up. Do you have a question? And I really encourage you to interrupt me with questions, and we can make this more of a discussion.
This is my question. How much of this escalated with the passage of Proposition 13? I know you're kind of young, so maybe you don't remember that, but how much of that was a replacement for not being able to tax?
Yeah, I think that is an important part of the puzzle, and you know, I would say there's, like, you know, it's hard to point to just one thing, but we do have things like Prop 13. I don't know if this group knows also about the GAN limit, which was passed. Mr. Gann, I think, was one of the proponents of Prop 13. And we have another constitutional amendment that really limits the growth of the state budget, which is also this, like, taxpayer rights, sort of small government approach to things. And that passed in the 70s, and California is a very different place with very different needs, and also with immense inequality in terms of our income. But we are we have a lot of difficulties and inflexibilities in the way our state budget can operate in order to redistribute that wealth and directly fund, as you were just pointing out, government services because of some of these constitutional limits on the way the state budget works. So it's something that is likely to come up in the next few years. The legislature is going to try and look to repeal this GAN limit. Or amend it in some sort of way, because although we have giant surpluses of revenue right now that the state is collecting because high income earners who are earning money off the stock market and in Silicon Valley, we have like historic tax receipts in the state, but the GAN limit sort of has this artificial way that the budget is allowed to grow each year. And so it prohibits the state from doing some of the investments in directly funding government services. And I'm very sympathetic to this. I'm going to talk about the civil assessment campaign that's going on right now, which is essentially where, for example, I'm a lawyer and I work in the court system. The court system has been underfunded in the last few decades because of this sort of like, we want small government approach and the limits on tax collection and the growth of taxes in California. And that's a problem. And it's actually a problem. It's even more of a problem for low-income Californians who are interacting with the court system and rely on many of its services, can't afford a private lawyer to help them navigate it, relying on the self-help centers, relying on the public defenders. And so we want, as a society, we want these institutions to be fully funded, but it is a broken and regressive way to fund it by adding on assessments and fees onto low-income Californians and disproportionately California, Black and Brown Californians as well. Move ahead. So this comes across, it's so small on my screen, so apologies if it's hard to read, but I just wanted to, this comes up in all areas, if you end up having a criminal case, if you have an infraction. This is an example from a traffic case of how we add on so many assessments and fees and surcharges to something that California then has these nationally some of the highest traffic and criminal fees in the country. So this is an example where in most, this is an old slide that I pulled up, but the legislature decides what it's going to charge, and there's a bail, and the Judicial Council works with it about what we're going to charge for certain traffic offenses. And the base fines are often things from $25 to $100, and maybe a little bit more than that. But after that, we add on penalty assessments, we add on surcharges, we add on the court operations assessment, court construction fund, all of these, the DNA, emergency medical transportation, night court assessment. And it with all that added on, it basically triples the cost of a traffic ticket in California. And these are things, again, that we're adding on assessments to fund government services, even though what the government has decided should be the punitive financial amount for violating whatever traffic offense it is supposed to be X. We're using this to fund other services by all these add-on fees. So if I'm a low income, I just talked about how we disproportionately see low income and Californians of color in these systems like traffic because of over policing, because of implicit bias and traffic stops. I'm more likely to show up in this and have to pay these fees. And because of the wealth gap, I might be less able to afford this ticket. And when we've also created these systems in California where we pile on the economic pain to somebody who is not able to just write a check or use their credit card to pay when they get a speeding ticket. We then add on administrative fees for all the reporting. People used to get their driver's license suspended for not being able to pay a ticket. And then we also add on this an assessment, a fee called a civil assessment, which is up to $300, although courts almost uniformly add on $300. And state law allows them to add on $300 for any time a person fails to appear on a traffic ticket or infraction ticket, or fails to pay it, including payment plans. If you miss a payment plan date, payment deadline, the courts can do that. And unfortunately, many of the courts have their case management system set up so these fees just get automatically added on without consideration of what the underlying offense was. And so you can see in this case how a $100 traffic fine can turn into an $800 fee. And I've seen cases with multiple civil assessments in them. So by the time I see a client who might be coming to me because they're trying to get a job, they have all these fees on there, they can't renew their driver's license because they have all these outstanding tickets, they're trying to figure out what to do, and they might have rolled through a stop sign, didn't have their insurance card with them, and those individual tickets have ballooned to over $1,000 a piece. And if you're someone who's barely making ends meet and trying to pay for the high cost of rent and high cost of living in the state, those traffic tickets then just become, an economic weight around your neck that makes everything a lot harder. And again, the civil assessments in particular, although they are they have this superficial gleam that they are punitive. I didn't show up in court to appear on my traffic ticket. I didn't pay my traffic ticket by the deadline, but that money goes right into the trial court trust fund, which funds the court system. And there's also a unfortunate and perhaps unconstitutional funding system set up where certain counties, and I didn't get a chance to look at how San Diego falls on this, but I know, for example, in Riverside and Kern County, some of the counties down near in Southern California, they have a certain amount of civil assessments that they collect that go into the trial trust fund that's then divided up to counties to courts around the state. But above us, they have it's called a maintenance of effort. Above that amount that they collect, they get to keep every single dollar. And so there's this perverse incentive for them to add on as big and as many civil assessments as possible. And there are courts that get several $1 million a year from this. Although at the same time, like in Kern County, for example, they have, I think they've assessed over 130 cents. They've started using their court management system and have records of it. They've assessed $137 million in civil assessments. They'd only collected 60, so that's a 50% rate. And they have outstanding civil assessments in 166,000 cases. So they're using this as a revenue system. But again, back to my earlier point, what this becomes for many people is an economic burden that they carry around. And so the court, we have this broken financial system where the courts are trying to do this to fund themselves. They have a perverse incentives to add it on. And more than half of the people, if not more, are getting caught up in this and just stuck in the economic debt of this and have the spiraling consequences of it. For the court. Yes.
I didn't quite understand what you meant when you said they assess this and then it goes right into the court trust fund. And then you said over and above that, I don't understand. That went a little bit fast for me.
Yeah, I can break that down a little bit. So, so it's the civil assessments are these almost always $300 chunks that get added onto a ticket that someone doesn't resolve. The court collects it. And as you can see from this example, right, that when I'm a court and I collect this traffic ticket, little pieces of it go all these different places, right, to fund all these different things. The civil assessment, the $300 penalty, goes first into the state fund called the trial court trust fund. I think it's called the trial court trust fund. Now I'm second guessing myself, but it's for funding of the courts. And so they send it to the Judicial Council and it goes into that fund, which then that fund generates about $100 million a year right now. And then that gets divided up and sent to the courts for their court operations, goes into their court general funds. And so every court gets some money from that trial court trust fund for their operations. There was a deal, I think it was in the 90s, where they were trying to increase again, because of things like Prop 13, things like the GAN limit, shrink we want little government, the lack of funding for the courts, that they needed to collect more money. They sort of reoriented this system. So they said, well, you have to give us, there was a certain year, and they said, every court has to try and collect up to that baseline year of 1998 or whatever it was, and deposit that money into the trial court trust fund. And so they continue to do that. And so Kern County's limit is that they have to collect up to $2 million. The first $2 million in civil assessment money that they collect goes into that fund that gets spread throughout the state. But if they collect $3 million in civil assessment funds, the first $2 million goes into the shared state fund, and the additional $1 million Kern County gets to keep directly for its operations. And so that's where the incentive comes in. If I'm Kern County, I want to collect $4 million in civil assessment funds, right? Because then because if I can get past that $2 million threshold, I get to keep directly. I don't have to have it spread out and dispersed throughout the state and share with other counties. I get to keep every single dollar of that for my general operating fund. And again, this is complicated. I'm sympathetic to the courts. The courts need money to operate, but we've created this system then that creates this perverse and likely unconstitutional system where there's this incentive to add on fees, rather than looking at the individual case and the individual person about, is this something they can afford? And is this something that's appropriate in this case? Yeah, I see another question.
Yeah, Rebecca, the 2 million you mentioned, is that, that's what it is, or were you just coming up with the number?
I happen to be looking at Kern County specifically right now. So I know that Kern County's, it's called a maintenance of effort, is around 2 million, and that they have collected an additional almost slightly above $2 million in the last 2 years.
Okay, so like a larger county like Los Angeles County would have a higher threshold.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So that's an example. And then here's other examples where fees come up. The juvenile fees was an issue, and I'm happy to talk about this also as a success that we've had. But for a while, parents of a young person who was caught up in the juvenile legal system and detained would have to pay for pay a daily fee for their detention, for the young person's stay in juvenile hall, and it was about $30 a day at the end of that policy. And so I have a young person, I might be low income, my child is in detention, they finally get out of juvenile detention, and now I owe $3,000, $6,000, $8,000 for the stay that they had in juvenile detention. There are also clothing fees. I might have had to pay back for the public defender and other kind of add-on fees that are not punitive, but are for the cost, are fees that are basically subsidizing the operation of the juvenile system. I see a question.
I just wanted to call attention to that. The committee just finished its school policing work, and the proliferation of arrests that occur because of over policing in schools and over referrals to school police is feeding into this fines. And I see it on the ground all the time.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And I don't know if this was part, but like, which schools are these in? They're in schools where the students are predominantly Black and Latino. They're in schools where the families are predominantly low income. And so again, we have this system where these types of fees are disproportionately borne by people of color and low-income Californians who can least afford them. And so we're, again, this perverse, regressive way that we're trying to offset government costs by piling these on to families. And, I'm a parent. I can't imagine if I had my young person in my family was in a juvenile system, the last thing that I needed to be worried about was, how am I going to pay thousands of dollars of fees? But more, what can I do to support my child while they're going through obviously some very difficult situation. And so these are also just bad policies in a lot of sense. And the same is true for folks who are coming home from being incarcerated, returning back to their communities, and they might have, you know, thousands of dollars of fees and restitution that they're having to deal with while they're trying to re-enter society, find a job, find a place to live, maybe catch up on child support, do all these things. And we're really hampering their ability to succeed by piling on all these fees. And again, fees are not punitive. Fees are these costs that we're trying to push over on criminal defendants or traffic defendants to fund our government or families in the case of juvenile. So that was one example. And I'm happy to say that a lot of the things on this list are actually no longer legal in California. Probation fees was another thing. I would get out of prison and I would have to pay. I was helping a client in Orange County, and he was paying $138 a month to pay for his probation. And so again, you're trying to get back on your feet, and you're paying, again, not paying off your fines and restitution, but you're just paying this cost for that goes into the probation department's operating budget. Public defender fees. When I first started doing this work, and you know, we have this myth of a free lawyer in this in the United States for people who can't afford one, but then you would at the end of your case be charged and have to pay back the cost of that lawyer. Probation and public defender fees are recently, as in from the last year and a half, not charged to defendants anymore in California. But there's drug testing fees, admin fees, all kinds of things. Yeah.
I know that the public defender fees have been done away with, but have they been done away with in the juvenile defense where a parent doesn't have to pay? Is that done too?
Yeah. And some of these at the bottom of the list, like I can't afford to pay something, and so I might ask for an alternative way to set it up. I might ask for a payment plan or community service. We charge people fees to get to use those options, even though by virtue of them asking for those things, they have they're low income and probably can't afford to pay those things. So as I was alluding to, we have had a lot of successes in California and nationwide about moving away from this regressive system of shifting the cost of the criminal legal system onto people who are caught up in it. So there has generally been a criminal justice reform movement in this country that sometimes is bipartisan. Part of that is self-interested because we grew this outside system that is incredibly expensive, and also the after costs of when helping people re-enter society and put their feet back under them is also incredibly expensive and time intensive. And so there's been a bipartisan movement away from some of that. And there has been a growing sort of network of service providers and money available to assist people who are re-entering, coming home from being incarcerated, and that's called attention to some of these issues. There's also the Department of Justice did a report after Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson about I don't know if this is something that folks are familiar with. It's a real long report, but you can skim through it, and just talking about the role in that community outside of St. Louis of the tension between the local government and the ticketing and sort of financial penalties and the way the government was funded through all these fees and fines that it was imposing on residents, mostly residents of color, and the breakdown of trust and the escalation of policing that creates in a community. And so it's really a lose-lose in a lot of and a broken way to fund the government. And that Department of Justice report came out during the Obama administration, really also provided a change in the narrative that has supported efforts in states across the country to speak up and, fueled campaigns to to eliminate fees and reduce the sort of financial penalties of our criminal legal systems because of the harm that it does to communities, the extraction of wealth, and the breakdown of that it creates between government and its citizens. Yes.
Yes, how would we find that Department of
I
Justice
could email
report?
it to you to share, but if you search Department of Justice report Ferguson, it'll come up. It's available by PDF on the internet pretty easily. But I'm happy to email you a copy after this.
Thank you.
After the presentation. I also just want to flag, I think there has been a growing conversation in our country, obviously an unfinished one, and one that began at the beginning of our founding, but has, maybe has played a role definitely in the fee repeal movement across the country, and other ways that poverty is punished. I do a lot of work on driver's license suspensions too, where the use of a driver's license suspension, where it's not about public safety, it's not about stopping someone who's driving 120 miles down the highway, it's about penalizing somebody who is unable to pay a ticket, unable to pay child support, and we use these punitive, we're punitive tools. Towing right now is another big area that we can talk about. But the conversation and the national attention, because of a lot of the police killings that have happened, and just really the role of race in our criminal legal system and over policing, and who is represented in the legal system, and then the way the financial impact, all of these issues are interrelated, and the financial impact on mostly Black and Latino citizens in our country of being pulled into, being impacted by the criminal legal system, and then also that they, because of structural inequalities that already exist in our country, are the least able to afford and bear these financial penalties. So there's just been more of an express conversation about looking at these structures and how they cause, and that has led to really frank conversations about the role of fees, and that they're the harm of them, not just and that they're bad policy, and that they're also harmful into the way they impact communities of color and extract further wealth from those communities.
I just want to bring this up because you're on this subject, but we don't think, we think about the criminal legal system and we think about fines and fees, but just to give you an example of something that fuels that too. I have a client whose SSI was terminated. So her disability income was terminated erroneously, but it took more than a year to get it back. And during that time, she had to get onto general relief. She lives with she takes care of an adult disabled child, right? And so when she finally got back on SSI, they just sent her a bill recently that she owes. The county sent her a bill saying you owe $3,327 for the general relief, and we're going to take it from your SSI. And you can come in and talk about a payment plan, but that's the name of that tune. And so she called legal aid. They're so busy. They can't even answer their phone. She called 4 days in a row. Can't answer their phone not because they don't want to, but they're too busy. We called disability rights. They don't even have lawyers there who have a minute to spend with you. So now her son, who has absolutely no money because they can't even survive on SSI. Yeah. So they go to the church for canned foods from the pantry to supplement, and she's diabetic, so they never get anything that's within her diet, right? And now he's starting to pilfer food from places because that's all the way they can get it. And now you could see he's going to probably get involved in this too. Yeah. And it's so horrible.
Yeah. I think that, yes, I'm so sorry to hear about that family's experience. And I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that we often talk about it in a really focused way about, after somebody is already in prison or whatever. And the conversation is about this like accountability for somebody who did something wrong. And we don't look at the broader societal issues about what led to that. And I think that is that's critical because of the escalation and the spiraling out of control about what happens. It's step by step, right? The example that you gave right there about a family that is doing its best to make ends meet, and because of all the outside pressures and the societal context and the structural barriers that are up for those families and individuals, they will find themselves pulled into the system that then spirals out of control and can have life-changing consequences for forever. I sometimes we talk also more broadly just about the role of penalizing people for being poor, for poverty, and like the conversation in Florida about reinstating people's right to vote after they had completed their criminal system is another one of these examples, and their criminal sentence and their probation. There was a big court fight about whether that would include having paid off all your fines and fees. And they interviewed individuals who were like, well, I did everything right, but I now owe, I still owe like $100,000 in restitution. I will never pay, I'm making payments monthly, but I basically have to win the lottery to be able to vote again. And I don't think that there's a full sort of like appreciation about and how counterproductive that is for us, for society, if we really are trying to build a sustainable society where everybody is invested in able to meet their basic needs and have economic opportunity. We're just shooting ourselves in the foot. And preventing people from having that same opportunity that the rest of us have. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute. I can tell you're really excited to say what you wanted to say.
I have one more example, expungement.
Mm-hmm.
The first question they ask you when you have an ages old thing that you want to get off your record, the first thing they ask you when you call the public defender's office is, have you paid your fines and fees?
Yeah.
And the district attorney, who has the authority to mitigate that, she won't, because she's running for office at some point, and she doesn't want to look like she's soft on crime. And so she said in public that we insist that accountability means that people have to pay off their fines and fees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's sad.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I so appreciate that. I think that, sometimes when I'm talking about these issues, I think bringing it back to the humans that are behind all these issues is so important, because that's what this is about, right? We can talk about this in big sweeping generalizations and the trends and the way we're changing the laws, but every one of the people who's impacted by this has a story, and has a story that is not just about this one little traffic ticket or criminal charge that they got. It's a full complex story about their life and all the barriers. And so I really appreciate you bringing those examples up. So a few things that have happened in California that I was talking about. We have had considerable improvements in traffic court and driver's license suspension laws in California. You could no longer have your driver's license suspended because you didn't pay a ticket. There are still billions of dollars of unpaid traffic fines and fees, which goes to show, which is like, it's not about accountability, because all those people, if we were trying to be like, oh, we suspended your license, we gave you this ticket, and we're holding you accountable, you can kind of see just from that example, what we're doing is plunging those people into debt, and they can't get out of it. So it's not a tool of accountability. It's not everybody likes to talk about the rich scofflaw who's just like, avoiding paying their ticket. But that's not really what's represented there. What's really represented in a lot of these systems is people for whom it's just economically impossible for them to pay these fees. So there's no more failure to pay driver's license suspensions. There is a growing, we're rolling out some ability to pay procedures in traffic court. So I can go in and say I receive SSI or food stamps, and the traffic court is supposed to reduce my traffic fine accordingly. There's lots of logistical implementation barriers to that all going well, but we have to keep the pressure on. That's where our organization does a lot of work, administrative advocacy, to make sure that people are getting the information they need to be able to take advantage of these changes in laws, that they can have their traffic tickets reduced to something that's supposed to be affordable for them. There's also been a real move away in California. That was just an example about ability to pay. I think that, I brought up that the difference between a fine and a fee. There is a Advocates in Debt-Free Justice California is really supportive of eliminating these fees, not having ability to pay procedures, because ability to pay procedures, like you were talking about, like how do you find out information about what you can do? There's not enough lawyers for people. There's not enough information. The barriers, there's so many barriers to people taking advantage of getting things reduced or having things changed to match their economic ability to pay them. And for some people, they just don't have any economic ability to pay something. And so we need to account for that as well. And so that's why, particularly for fees, it's a no-brainer. We should be funding these things. These are public goods that our society should be funding directly, not through shifting the costs to low-income Californians and trapping them in debt that have all these collateral consequences. So there's a real emphasis on, we are about elimination of fees, not ability to pay procedures. Where possible. I think that conversation is harder when we're talking about a punitive fine. That's actually the punishment element of it, as opposed to all those add-on fees and assessments that I talked about. That $100 base fine for speeding. Well, then maybe if we are able to really eliminate all these fees and directly fund things, and we're talking about something that's more manageable, maybe that ability to pay can come in. But that's an evolving conversation. Juvenile fees have been both eliminated and discharged in California. So that was great. I think the article that was circulated was about San Diego finally stopping the collection of previously assessed juvenile administrative fees. I'm working on a class action lawsuit against Riverside, who was supposed to consider families' ability to pay before charging them these detention fees for their for their child being involved in the juvenile legal system, and didn't. And we're hopefully going to return about $500,000 to families who were charged those fees by Riverside and had them collected. But the good news is that those fees aren't charged anymore to families, parents, and guardians who have a young person in the juvenile system.
Just questioning, when a child is removed from a home by the Child Protective Services, okay, and stuck in foster care, and the person is found not to have had any substantiated wrongdoing, okay?
Yes.
It used to be that the parents still had to pay for that. I've seen parents destitute with those kinds of things. Is that still true?
So juvenile system has two sides to it, right? The delinquency, and all these terms are very old fashioned and not very respectful to the people being caught up in them, but the delinquency system and the dependency side. So there are still, that's an issue that is on the horizon for reform, is that families where CPS might take a child into custody or foster care can still be charged for the sort of like child support foster payments that come up because of that. Those are still in place. It's the delinquency side where these fees have been eliminated. And so that the child organizations that work on the child welfare system and reform are looking at those issues too, and making sure there's right to counsel for people, making sure people are full aware of their benefits and what kind of financial supports are available in those systems. There's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Want to hear a bad story?
Sure.
I have had a client whose children were removed and put into foster care because of domestic violence, not hers, but the parent, the other parent. Okay. And so they were kept in foster care for a year while she went through, a divorce and everything, and squared up everything. He took off. So she landed with the cost of the of the care of the kids in foster care. A huge, absolutely huge bill. And they garnished her wage. She was a housekeeper.
Mhm.
Garnished her wage and she had $64 a month to live on. Honest to God, is horrible.
Yeah.
So she went on public assistance because that was all she could do.
Yeah.
And then because she made a mistake in her, her paperwork or something, she had to then defend against a welfare fraud
Mhm.
charge. She was successful, but think about it.
Yeah.
There were 5 people, 5 kids and a parent living in one room in a house.
Yeah.
And she had $64, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I have too many stories. I'm sorry.
No, and I mean, and I think some of these themes that we've been talking about, like, why does that make public policy sense? Protecting children is a role of government that we are committed to, and so why are we shifting the cost of supporting that family through that year to the family? That's something that's like a regressive backwards ways that then creates all these obstacles for them to be successful at the end of that year. And it's the same for all these types of fees and it's also related to the social safety net of our country and what we're really, it's all these stories that you've shared too about individuals who are like, it's inextricable from their ability to meet their basic needs and what's available in terms of public benefits and and the difficulties for work and things like that. Another thing on my list here is collection protections. There's starting to be more awareness of the way the collection of fees and other kinds of financial obligations really impacts people. There have been some really important reforms in the consumer world in terms of protecting a minimum amount. Like if I have a credit card judgment against me, right, protecting a certain amount in my bank account so that I could pay my rent, lowering, and if the way we figure out how much can be garnished from somebody's wages, attaching it to minimum wages that especially for cities that have a higher minimum wage because of the cost of living, things like that. And those are now being imported over into like the franchise tax board as of January of this year has to apply some of those same standards to their collection of court ordered debt. So if I have like old criminal debt that I'm paying, the franchise tax board also can't zero out my bank account. They have to have this limit in here. They have to use these consumer rules for how much can be garnished because we're undermining people's ability to be successful economically if we just have no sort of limitations on what that is. And there's so much more that can be done there. There's a lot of discussion going on right now. The child tax credit that was passed on the federal level during the pandemic that was putting money directly into families' pockets, and the people were getting monthly payments for who had young children. There's a state version of that too. And unfortunately, the franchise tax board is also in the business of collecting court ordered debt. And so we were seeing instances where I'm a family who qualifies for the state child tax credit or the state earned income tax credit. And those are policies that we have decided as a state we need to give their poverty tools. Gavin Newsom talks about this all the time, about those are poverty fighting tools, wealth inequality tools that we want to make sure low-income families are getting those credits. And you're only eligible for those if you're under a certain annual income. But then we were letting the franchise tax board, so we have the government having this policy to help families, and then the franchise tax board is taking that money to pay for different they can seize people's tax refund and send it to a county for parking tickets, for traffic tickets, for unpaid vehicle registration, all these things. And so we're just undermining our own policy goals by allowing that type of aggressive collection by the franchise tax board and just seizing people's tax refunds. So again, this is a complicated area that isn't just about the fee that I might be charged at the courthouse, and it just rolls over into so many areas. there has been, one last thing that I didn't talk about this, there has been a lot of success. 2 years in a row, the state legislature and the governor have eliminated, it's up to about 40 criminal administrative fees. I mentioned some of those, the public defender fees, the probation fees, there's some drug testing fees, there's a whole, it's 40 different fees. So there's a whole lot, but there's more to be done. I think that Debt-Free Justice Coalition identified about is between 60 and 80 different just administrative fees that are in the in California law. And so each year they're taking on tackling another set of them. And then we've talked about some of these things, but and I'll just some of the things that we're still working on. So there is a campaign this year, and we're very hopeful that the legislature and the governor are gonna include this as part of the budget negotiations this month, is to repeal those $300 civil assessments that get added onto infraction and traffic tickets to fund the courts, and instead fund the courts directly through the state general fund. There's an Air Talk segment, and I'll send the link around with that Department of Justice report that I'm gonna email that talks, that's really nice 15-minute sort of summary. There's a professor from UCLA and a lawyer who's part of the Debt-Free Justice Coalition talking about that campaign. So, and a lot of the same themes that we're talking about today. So I'll share that. There's legislation to, as I mentioned, continue chipping away at repealing additional administrative fees. One part of this that I'll point out, and is something that you all might look for in San Diego, is that as these administrative fees are repealed, there's often in almost all cases, there's backfill money that has been given to the counties. So if the counties aren't collecting these fees from people who are in the criminal legal system or the juvenile legal system, we're backfilling that money. So they're getting more money from the state budget and the general fund. So for example, the bill that passed 2 years ago, AB 1869, San Diego, and these backfill payments are coming for 5 years. The idea is to sort of transition away from the use of these fees. I think they're getting about $5 million a year. And so what are they spending that money on is something. There's advocates in local communities are kind of keeping their eyes on that, because there's also the hope that some of that money, there's a group in the Inland Empire in Riverside and San Bernardino that's trying to encourage their counties to use that money, not just drop it into the sheriff's budget, but to use that money to help people who were impacted by these fees to begin with, for reentry services, for reentry housing supports, for job training, for making jobs available, for apprenticeship programs. And so that's an area that people can do sort of some local advocacy, because it's about how that backfill money is being spent. And there, like I mentioned, an additional law passed last year that's going to have backfill money. The civil assessment money is going to have backfill money. It's as we take away these fees, there's just a lot of money going to the local counties, and an opportunity to advocate on how they're spent. Restitution reform, is it Joni? That you mentioned, when you're doing expungement, you have to go in and talk about how whether you still owe fines and fees. There's a bill this year that's going to that hopefully will be successful to so that unpaid restitution cannot be a basis for denying someone an expungement, denying someone's expungement petition. And that's because you might be in good faith on a payment plan paying that, but how are you supposed to make your payments if you're not able to work, and if your criminal background check is preventing you from getting a job that might pay more money? So it's just like common sense. So there's some important reforms to the restitution system that are happening. Debt-Free Justice Coalition is doing a lot of research and looking at the restitution system. Like some of these other systems, there's an ideal goal about what restitution is supposed to do. It's supposed to support a victim of a crime and make them whole and help them after something. But unfortunately, our restitution system is really broken. It really penalizes people, and it's not actually doing a very good job helping people who are victims. And again, this is like we're shifting the cost and the administration of the system onto the shoulders of people who can't afford to pay it. And then that hurts everybody. We're making people not able to move on in their lives and reinvent themselves after being incarcerated, but we're also not helping people who are harmed by crime. And in so many cases, these are the same communities that are getting harmed by these policies in two ways. So we're hopeful that there's going to be some better looks at how do we really, data driven, like real analysis of like, what are the goals of the system? Are we achieving them? And what's the best way to make changes so that we are achieving them? And we're also trying to have conversations about rethinking fines and accountability, like we've talked about, what really makes us safer, what makes our community safer, what is justice, how do we move on, think conversations like that, and restructuring how we fund government and addressing the inequality. Yeah, please, that's the end of my talk. So I'd love any more discussion. So
If I'm not taking anybody's turn.
no.
Okay, I just want to say this. Western Center on Law and Poverty has been the preeminent fighters for people who have with low income for years, for decades. And pound for pound, you guys have, I say this in all sincerity, some of the very best lawyers that have ever taken on these causes. And you basically do this on, I would say it's sort of a shoestring budget, because you have a shitload of work to do, and you don't have a big staff. But, if you tangle with a Western Center lawyer on any of these issues, you have something to reckon with. So I just want to commend you guys for the work that you do, and you have done for so many years, because I have seen in the field how much of a difference you guys have made. And let me give you one example so everybody can enjoy this. Back when I was working in administrative hearings for public benefits, okay, there was a law that said that if a kid got a merit-based scholarship in high school or whenever for college, right, that the welfare department would count that as income in the next reporting month and then deduct from their welfare grant in the following month. It was, so the kids are not stupid, especially the ones who are getting merit-based scholarships. And they said, well, why are we even trying? We're buying groceries with our scholarship money. This is the gift of Western Center to all of us, that they meet up with guys in the field like me and real people who are working with real people, and they harvest those and they become their plaintiff class. They become their informers about how public policy really works on the ground. And then these guys go to battle and they changed that law. Western Center on Poverty and Law changed that law. And now those merit-based scholarships don't count as income anymore. So I just want to say, I salute you.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been at Western Center for 4 years, and I feel so privileged to get to work with this organization. And as you're pointing out, we have this amazing history of advocates who've worked on such amazing issues. Derek Bell, who's like a preeminent legal scholar, was one of our founders and first lawyers. And I walk down a path that has been built by amazing individuals, and I feel so lucky. And I'm so glad that you pointed out our connections with other organizations, because we are small and we are only able to do the things that we do because we are partnering with so many amazing local organizations, organizations led by people who are impacted by these policies. So when we're in Sacramento changing a bill, we have individuals who've had that happen to them, who can talk to the legislature and tell that. And so we really play a facilitating role. And I often feel guilty getting any credit for it, because so many of these issues are coming up from direct service providers, service organizations, and we are trying to help where a lawsuit or legislative change could come in and help use our tools to further the work of those amazing individuals and organizations. So thank you.
Rebecca, yeah, I wanted to ask, so where should we go? I'm just wondering, you talked about the Gann Amendment and the Franchise Tax Board, and that those seem to be like state the state league could work on those, but do you see anything particular that San Diego should, we can work on a number of these things, or what seems to be hurting people the most that we could, try to get at?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think people are being hurt in so many different ways. San Francisco has like an office within their treasurer's office called the Financial Justice Project.
Mhm.
And I'll include a link again for them in my email. They are really an amazing organization because they are suggesting ways that the county can innovate to help low-income San Franciscans. And they have come up with things about how to help with parking tickets, making jail calls free, changing laws that are county laws versus state laws. And so I think that there could be a lot of inspiration from some of the things that they've done. And again, like when I was so much of this is about how implementation happens on the road, where the rubber hits the road, right? There are, like, for San Diego at some point will be one of the counties that's rolling out this ability to pay pilot for traffic tickets. If people don't know about it, if it doesn't work well, if they're not advertising it, like how the county implements a lot of these changes is really important. How the county spends this backfill money is really important. So I don't know that I can speak first in San Diego for what exactly is right, but I just think that a lot of these changes are happening on a local level, and how they are implemented, and how and ways that there are things that the county can do to change how it approaches these problems is so important. And so there's really a lot of work to be done at the county level. I could probably help brainstorm some other, organizations that are particularly working on criminal fines and fees work. In San Diego or in nearby organizations, to get some ideas about what can we do at our local level. LA has done a lot of good work for just really changing, and it sounds like you all are doing this already and looking for opportunities about policing, about traffic stops, about building of jails, about just all the different aspects of how these systems work that are impacting these same communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe ACLU. So Youssef, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, wonderful presentation, Rebecca. It was very powerful. And like you said, yes, here in San Diego, first of all, I'm Youssef Miller with the North County Equity and Justice Coalition and the Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego. A lot of that work is going on here locally with phone calls for inmates, bail bonds issues, all those issues that are related. But yeah, they are going on here, and I want to congratulate you on your topic here. It was very thorough, very, very good. But I also wanted to bring up another related topic. It might not seem related, but it is. I want to say happy Juneteenth to everyone here. And this is African American Independence Day. And the difference between the 4th of July and June 19th for African Americans, which is now a federal holiday, is that from 1776, which is the 4th of July, to June 1965, that's 89 years of celebrations of liberty where African Americans were chained and enslaved. And like that, from 1814, where we get our national anthem, to 1865 is 51 years, while African Americans were enslaved, and our national anthem of Land of the Free and Home of the Brave was going on. So it's very important. Now, the reason why I bring that up in combination with this topic is when the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, it said except for those incarcerated or those on a crime, guilty of a crime. So that slavery is still being played out in our legal system, and with our inmates, they work for slave wages, and if any wages at all. So it's part of this same discussion where not only are there fees and fines, but those who are incarcerated are still in a de facto slavery from these work systems, and like you said earlier, the removal of their amendment rights to vote, to be a voter. So I wanted to tie those two things together, keep the Miller time thing rolling from Rebecca Miller to Youssef Miller, and acknowledge that Juneteenth is part and parcel of this whole conversation when we talk about fines and fees from the legal system on people of color. So again, that was a quick down and dirty about Juneteenth. And I just wanted to League of Women Voters to have this on your record that you did talk about Juneteenth in June. So thank you very much, guys.
And thank you, Youssef. By the way, our book club did listen to the 13th, that video, which I'm not sure if all of you have seen it, but it is very, very powerful. That brings that up about the 13th Amendments.
Thank you. And my colleague is also here, Dr. Darwin Fishman, with the both North County Equity and Justice Coalition and Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego, and he's on the Juvenile Justice Commission here in San Diego.
We'll have to work with both of you. Yes.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah, as we were talking about, there's so many of these issues, you can't extract them from the structural inequality that we have baked into our system, so much of which is related to our founding and our founding on a system that included slavery and what that still means for us today. And, you know, there's a couple books, obviously, Michelle Alexander's, you know, A New Jim Crow, and there's Slavery by Another Name that get at some of those exact issues. And so that's an important campaign and to end those slavery level wages in prisons. And I'm hopeful that something that it's a next frontier. There's so much more work to be done. It's wonderful that we can take a beat and celebrate what has been done, but so much to be done. Yeah.
Yes. And our summer reading is 1619 Project.
That's great.
So,
yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead, Youssef.
No, I just was saying awesome that you were reading 1619 Project. And may I add another little caveat to the 1619 Project? It is a wonderful project, wonderful storyline. It is incomplete because 1619 Project only talks about the British enslavement, but the enslavement in this hemisphere started with the Portuguese and the Spanish over 100 years before 1619. But that is not to disparage the project. The project is perfect. The project is great. It is just concentrating on the British involvement in that period.
Mm-hmm. And we've also read and if you haven't read this, the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, which
yes.
again was amazing. So yeah, it's sometimes you have to go for a walk or something because you just get so depressed by so much of it. But yes,
but
we're
so
learning a lot.
to keep it the front of our thoughts because it's all inextricably related to where we are today, right?
Right. Criminal justice is right in it.
Thank you all so much for inviting me to come and talk. And I'm just also so appreciative of all the work that you all are doing on these important issues in San Diego too.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
assuming we pass our police study on Saturday, I'll send you our positions, so our new positions. So thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a great day.
Yes.
Bye.
You too. Bye.